And we are live. I'm going to start to let everyone in. Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started in a few moments. We're just waiting on a few more to join us. Thank you all for joining. My name is Patrick Watson. I'm one of the executive board members here with Indivisible, Illinois. We've got a great topic for you today. We're doing a deep dive on redistricting, which I know is a topic everyone is very interested in. So for everyone, if you can go ahead and put your names and your locations into the chat. Also, if you are involved with a local Indivisible group, if you can put that into the chat as well. So just your name, location, and if you're involved with an Indivisible group or another allied group. And we'll get started in a couple of minutes as we wait on more to join. I see folks from Texas who are on, and I see Illinois, Evanston, Indivisible. I see Tennessee. I see Evanston. I see Chicago. I see Philadelphia. We've got folks from all over the country who are on. I see Charleston. I see Massachusetts. I see St. Charles, Illinois, Bolingbrook, Ohio, Naperville. We've got a lot of great people on, and there are more that are joining. So welcome. Thank you all for being here. We're going to first start things off with a few brief announcements and a few just statements about what's happening nationally within the country. So I'd like to introduce you all to the other board members here from Indivisible, Illinois. Let's start with Linda.
Hi, everybody. Linda Callis. As Patrick said, I'm on the executive board. I am also on leadership for Indivisible DuPage, and also leadership for a every other Friday Truth Social or Truth Sandwich Shop, where we highlight false information and try to put the truth out on social media. And right now, obviously, our main focus for the last one was basically the fact that people are being censored and with false information, using false information as an excuse. So that was something we focused on last Friday.
Great. Let's next go to Jeanette.
Hi, I'm Jeanette Quirk. I'm on the board here, and I'm a member of the leadership team for Indivisible West Suburban Chicago, and also a member of the Indivisible Chicago Alliance Council. And I'm on the outreach committee, and I help with phone banks and a lot of other things.
Fantastic. Let's go to Marcy.
Hi, I'm Marcy. I am also on the Indivisible Illinois Exec Board. I live in Champaign, and I am also a member of Champaign County Indivisible, and I am the phone bank lead. And actually, I am going to tell you about phone banks. Not a surprise to a lot of you. Every Saturday and Sunday, we phone bank. On Saturdays, we phone bank to Virginia to tell voters to vote for Abigail Spanberger, and also some down ballot candidates that are also statewide. And that is from 5 to 6:30 Central Time, and it's on Zoom. I will put the links in the chat to it. And now they are having early voting, so it's really important now, and it is a really tight race. On Sundays, we phone bank from 4 to 5:30, and we phone bank into the 3 Republican districts in Illinois: the Illinois 12, Mike Boss district, Illinois 15, Mary Miller's district, and Illinois 16, Darren LaHood's district. And we let their voters know that they voted to cut Medicaid and what that means to them and what that means to their district. And I will put links to the next several weeks worth of phone banks in the chat in just a moment.
Thank you, Marcy. And again, my name is Patrick Watson. I'm also one of the executive board members here with Indivisible Illinois, also on the leadership team for NWSOFA, the Comprehensive Immigration Reform Lead there. And with Indivisible Illinois. I co-chair the Communications Committee as well as the Voter Engagement Committee. So I'd like to tell you all about our Neighborhood Canvas Leader program, where if you are anywhere within Illinois, we can get you set up to canvass your precinct to talk with voters about the issues, as well as some of our key congressional districts that we want to make sure that people know of their member of Congress's extreme positions on the issues. We want to let them know how they voted on a number of these key issues. So we're doing some targeted canvassing in those congressional districts, as well as if you're interested in taking ownership over your own precinct and just talking with voters about the issues and making sure that they're informed, we can get you signed up for that. We'll put the link to that into the chat momentarily. So that brings us to today. We're talking about redistricting. We're at a very difficult time in our country right now. Things seem to be more divided than they have ever been. We are seeing ICE harass many people who have been in the country and know no country but the U.S. We've seen, I'm sure you all have seen what's happening in Illinois with one of the detention facilities where they're processing people. It's made national news lately, and the president has obviously threatened to send the National Guard consistently into Illinois. He does it every day. In fact, he did it again today. A lot of this division that we're seeing is being caused by some of the gerrymandering that we're seeing across the country. It's these extreme districts that is making our politicians more extreme to serve that extreme base. And what we're going to learn about today is just what we can do about some of the gerrymandering that we're seeing all across the country. We're going to learn why that gerrymandering is happening and what we can do to combat it at the national level. So I'd like to introduce you all to Eric DeBellis. Eric is a Palatine-based non-for-profit attorney. He's also a political consultant who's organized many field campaigns in the northwest suburbs of Illinois. He also advises state and local officials on redistricting, which brings us to the topic today of redistricting. So I'd like to hand it over to Eric DeBellis.
Hey everyone, I will get the screen shared in just a moment. Okay, everyone can see that all right? Yeah. Okay, so I got a lot to cover today, so I'm gonna jump right into it on today's agenda on the topic of redistricting. We're going to start with the rules set forth in the U.S. Constitution that always apply, assuming judges continue to read it. The Voting Rights Act rules that apply, then where cheating is otherwise legal and how that has affected democracy in many states, including close to home. And I'll be honest with you all here. Legal reforms that many states have tried, and the extent to which it promotes more lowercase d democratic outcomes that respect voters' wishes, what a fair map is and how complicated a question that is, what the trade-offs that entails are, and why we probably can't just ask a computer programmer or math to do it for us. And then I would like to hear any questions that you guys have. Happy to talk about any relevant subject. So first, what does the Constitution require? Well, Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution, so right at the beginning, creates Congress. Section 2 talks about how they are elected, where from. So the U.S. House, our lower chamber of the legislature, whereas the Senate is elected statewide, U.S. House reps are elected within geographic districts. So the Constitution says representatives shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers. The actual numeration shall be made within 3 years. So that was the first census ever. And then within every subsequent term of 10 years. So the Supreme Court has interpreted that language to mean that congressional candidates and members of Congress have to live in the state that the district they represent is in, but they technically don't have to live in the district. States can require their state and local reps to live in district, but they can't require the members of Congress to live within the district because they can't contradict something that's directly spelled out in the Constitution. Each state gets at least one US House rep. Even Wyoming, which is mostly moose, I've been there. And the number of additional reps each state gets, if they get any, is proportional to its population. So California is the most populated state. It has 52 districts. Some smaller states like Rhode Island has 2. Somewhere in one of the bigger states, Illinois has 17. That's all according to our population. And so the population is recounted every 10 years in the census. Each state's districts must have as equal as practical numbers of people in them. Yes, a state in the 60s tried to put more people in some districts than in others, and they lost before the Supreme Court. And that applies to state and local offices too. But keep in mind, this is total population. People who can't vote still count. So for example, in Chicago has 50 wards, famously, right? And one of the, I believe is it the 22nd? I believe that includes most or all of Little Village, which of course has a younger population than most places. A huge portion of the population are children who can't vote. And there are a large number of people who are not US citizens. Now, I want to be clear, you can be here totally legally and not be a citizen, right? You can have a valid visa, a green card, what have you, and you're still not allowed to vote, even though it's perfectly legal that you're here. People who can't vote still count. So like the 50th ward, or sorry, the 22nd ward, I think it is, has as many people as all the other wards, but significantly less eligible voters. And this ends up making a big difference in areas where the population skews very young or where there are a lot of immigrants. Turnout varies very much by district. So you'll see districts where a fraction as many people voted, and they still elect a representative, even though another district might have higher turnout. It is by population. Texas tried to throw that out, and lost a lawsuit on that in 2016. They tried to only count people who were eligible to vote, so that basically like the Rio Grande Valley, which is heavily immigrant, has a lot of kids, would all be one district, and then the sort of older, more native-born places would effectively get more say. The Supreme Court rejected that. So the districts have to be contiguous, which means all of the precincts that make it up have to touch each other. Now, that's the old earmuffs district. People called it the Illinois' 4th congressional district in the last round. That counted as contiguous, even though you can see that there's a stretch of highway where obviously no one lives on 294, though if traffic's bad, a lot of people do feel like they at least have a timeshare there. That is legal, but that's an extreme example. I'll have more to say about this district later. There's actually a completely valid reason why it was shaped this way, though, of course, it doesn't look good, right? And that's sort of one of the trade-offs that we have. So Article 1, Section 4, the Elections Clause, then says, the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be described in each state by the legislature thereof, but the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations, except as to the places of choosing senators. So that means each state's legislature determines their own maps for both congressional and state legislature seats. So they pass it like any other law, right? It passes both chambers of the state legislature, signed by the governor. The governor doesn't sign it. They can override the veto with a supermajority. Exception being Nebraska, which only has one chamber in its legislature. So states can add more rules. They can restrain unfair practices within their state that federal law doesn't touch. And Congress can add rules that aren't spelled out in the Constitution, as long as it doesn't conflict with what is in the Constitution. So like the famous HR 1, right? HB 1 proposal from House Democrats on trying to fight gerrymandering nationally and have independent redistricting nationally. They're allowed to do that legally, right? It's just getting politicians to give up the right to choose their voters instead of having to let their voters choose them, you can see how it's hard to convince politicians to do that, though many states have, on principle, done so. And yes, that is how the founding fathers spelled choosing, with a U. English has changed. So it's a clear conflict of interest. The Constitution tasks state legislators with drawing their own districts. So, of course, they're going to naturally tend to try to get themselves an advantage. And when they draw maps to benefit themselves, either politically or in some cases personally, we call that gerrymandering. And so gerrymandering, the name comes from, there was this politician in Massachusetts over 200 years ago named Elbridge Gerry, who drew a map that had a district that looked like a salamander. And so people called it the gerrymander. But we say gerrymander now because we're just mispronouncing his name. But if you try to say gerrymander, people would look at you like you were crazy. So forget what I said. Federal law has some requirements too. The Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 spells out in Section 2 that you cannot discriminate against a racial minority group via minority vote dilution. And that comes in two flavors, packing and cracking. I'll explain what those are. So here you have just an illustration. You can look at the red and blue as Democrats and Republicans or as different racial groups or whatever you want. They're two different groups, right? You have an area here where half are red and half are blue. And each one of these different carvings up of 4 districts, dividing them in the quarters, has the same, is contiguous, like required, and has equal population, as is required. But you can draw it so that you have a stable 3-1 blue majority or stable 3-1 red majority, depending on how you draw the lines. So hacking, in this middle example you see here, is where they put a district of entirely reds. And now mathematically, that means because it's half and half, if you pack all of the reds into one district, the rest of the districts are majority blue. Cracking is where you see there are blues in every one of these districts, but 3 of them are majority red because they split up the red support and diluted it among multiple districts. I'll show you some examples that'll make this make more real concrete sense. So here's a real world example of racial hacking and cracking. So Louisiana is about 1/3 Black by population, and it is very segregated racially. Circled, you can see these cities that have a population of over 100,000, where at least 45% of the population is Black. The 2 largest cities in the state, both of which have very large Black populations, are New Orleans, you can see at the bottom right, and Baton Rouge, which is the capital city. It's not too far from New Orleans. And then farther northwest, you see Shreveport. The way that the Republicans in the state drew their districts, they packed the Black population centers of Baton Rouge and New Orleans, both 2 different metropolitan areas, into the 2nd district, which, as you'd imagine, is an overwhelmingly majority Black district. They also lump them in with more liberal-leaning white areas. And as you can see so these districts are colored, they're shaded by the percentage of the voting age population that is Black. 4 and 5 are have significant Black populations, but places like Alexandria, Shreveport, Monroe that have large Black populations are cracked apart enough that there aren't enough Black voters to have a predominant say in who represents them. So they're packed into the 2nd district and then up north cracked between the 4th and 5th. This is an issue because voting is extremely racially polarized in Louisiana. Now, it's typical in a lot of states that somewhere in the ballpark of 90% of Black voters tend to lean Democratic in most cycles. But in the Deep South, certainly including Louisiana, white voters are just about as far in the Republican direction. So the racial composition of the district looks a whole lot like the racial and partisan compositions look very similar. And so you have a Black population that is largely voting for candidates that the white population is largely voting against, and vice versa. Because of that polarization, the racial composition of the district is extremely important. And yeah, so that's the partisan breakdown there. And to be clear, I didn't, so the way it's colored, it's not that everything that leans even a little Republican is bright red and everything that leans even a little Democratic is bright blue. Those are the most extreme shades I had in the palette, right? None of these districts are remotely competitive. You're either in an overwhelmingly white and overwhelmingly Republican district or a predominantly Black and very, very Democratic. So even this Supreme Court, as much partisan bias as they have shown in many decisions in recent years, I have to admit, even they said, okay, that's a clear violation of Voting Rights Act Section 2. So they ordered the state to create a second opportunity district, they're called, for Black voters. Admittedly, the shape is very squiggly, but as you saw a few slides ago, that diagonal you see connects the large Black population centers in the state. And so eventually, to comply with the court order, the state drew this map. And in case you're curious, they put the home of their least popular Republican colleague in one of the new blue districts just to mess with him, because politics. So he endorsed the Republican governor's opponent in the primary, and his guy lost. So then he lost his seat when this happened. So petty politics get thrown in, but this is a victory for representation for a group that is roughly a third of the state's population, and now is the primary voice and constituency for 2 of the 6 districts, 1/3. In that sense, this feels very proportional. Of course, there's a trade-off here that imagine trying to run constituent services for a district that runs from Baton Rouge to Shreveport, right? There are challenges in that. And yes, both the majority Black districts vote overwhelmingly Democratic. And yes, Republicans are currently suing to try to throw it back to the way it was. So the political cartoon you see in the lower right corner is Elbridge Gary's district. That this cartoonist thought it looked like a dragon. Other people thought salamander. So where cheating is legal. There's no national law against politicians drawing districts to advantage themselves or their parties. The only restrictions on partisan gerrymandering come at the state level. States have to take it upon themselves. So we're caught in this big uncooperative game. The decision that most recently said that was Gill v. Whitford, and I have a picture of Scott Walker not making eye contact because Gill v. Whitford was a Wisconsin case that came to the Supreme Court. So here's some partisan packing and cracking that we see. I know it's been in the news. Texas's new updated gerrymander, right? They had already gerrymandered their districts after the 2020 census. And then the White House told them, I want more. And so they redrew their district again in the middle of the decade, which is very unusual, but allowed in most states technically. They redrew it to pack even more of the Democratic voters into as few districts as possible and crack the rest among Republican-leaning districts. So I have here the 2020 presidential vote by district. I did 2020 for this graphic because that would have been the most recent information before the post-2020 census redistricting cycle that they would have been looking at, right? Had they not gone mid-cycle again. And so a fair alternative I drew, I'm not going to tell you how much time that took me. As you can see, the lines are a lot cleaner. There are several honest to God swing districts, and I'll zoom in and give you an idea of it. I see Patrick squinting. And the blue cities have more than one Democratic district, whereas when you look at the gerrymander that Texas Republicans drew, they packed as many Democrats in each major city as possible into one district, and then basically bacon strip gerrymandered everybody else in the metropolitan area into districts that were mostly exurban and rural and Republican heavy. So that is then looking at 2024 presidential vote. Obviously, as many know, Texas swung more Republican in 2024 than in 2020. You can see that's especially true in the Rio Grande Valley, the southern portion near the border. And you can see that that map is blood red, right? There are tiny little blue dots where they packed everybody in a major city into a district, or at least as many as they could. So on the left, you see a fair version of Houston that I drew, of the Houston metropolitan area, compliant with the Voting Rights Act and every other legal requirement. And you have 3 very blue districts, 1 pretty blue one, 3 swing districts that'll be very competitive, to where the representative might actually care what voters who don't vote in primaries think, heaven forbid. And then the rest of the area is very red. In their version, Houston gets 3 Democrats and everybody else, all the other districts are blood red. And the second district, you see how it spindles into Houston proper? That's to pick up Dan Crenshaw's house. He represents that district. So yeah, remember partisan cracking? Yeah, don't get more obvious than this. I mean, look at that. They pretty much perfectly outlined the bluest precincts to pack them into the fewest districts possible. Now, I believe at least one of these was required by the Voting Rights Act because it's a majority-minority district. But they did gerrymander out Al Green, who is a member of the Congressional Black Caucus. He was older and he's retiring, but he will be almost certainly replaced by a Republican because they changed the lines, not because the voters changed their minds. And Dallas and Fort Worth Metro, you see here, you know, I don't think them somehow losing to the Bears changes any of this, but I am kind of stoked about that. Shout out to Texas. Love you guys and your very injured defense. I hope it recovers. But so a fair version, you're looking at 3 very blue districts, another pretty blue one. Colin Allred's old district, if you're familiar with him. I replaced him on the Berkeley Law School softball team back in the day. His 32nd district is still pretty Democratic leaning, but borderline competitive. And then Plano Frisco gets a swing district. And out just northwest of there, you have a fringe competitive Republican district, right? Where if you have a bad cycle and the rep is really unpopular, they could lose. A fair district, one could define, is one that the incumbent can conceivably lose. Just like I used to work for Professor Jose Antonio Chebub, who his definition of democracy is a place where governments can lose elections and then they leave. So their version of Dallas-Fort Worth, though, you get 2 Democratic districts and you will like it, right? And everything else is very, very red. And I don't even, so by the Garland area, what they did to the 32nd district, it doesn't even fit in the map. It goes out almost out to like Tyler, Texas and the border. It just keeps zooming out and then swallows a bunch of rural precincts that are over 100 miles away from Garland. Just did not care at all about geography. Austin and San Antonio, you see here, you can see Austin and San Antonio clearly on the second map on the right because they gave each of them 1 blue district. And that's packing, and the rest is correct, where they took something that if you were fair about it, and again, the districts that I drew here, you end up with a map that in a typical election the partisan breakdown of seats would look pretty much identical to the statewide vote. This is not me showing you what a Democratic dream map looks like. This is just my attempt to be fair and normal of like what a boring independent person would do. And there's a huge, huge difference there. But let's not get too smug about it. Illinois is one of the most gerrymandered states in the country. All right, let's be honest here. That is intentional. Look at that. Right. I saw some folks from Metro East. Shout out to you guys on here. Would you guys consider yourself a community of interest with Urbana-Champaign? Maybe not. It's a bit of a snake there, right? The 17th district, of course, goes from Rockford to Bloomington Normal, which, you know, it's a bit of a jaunt. Obviously, these are intentional choices that were made to get more Democrats in Congress, right? Though I will say some of these stranger-shaped districts in Illinois are for Voting Rights Act compliance reasons, to get an appropriate amount of representation for our very diverse states, very diverse voting population. So a fair alternative I drew on the right, you see there, still has some districts around Chicago that you can see are shaped a little funky. That's for Voting Rights Act reasons. And the rest is pretty compact. And, you know, I threw Springfield, Bloomington, and Urbana-Champaign together and got a swing district for East Central Illinois. That seems very normal, right? It's a swingy area. Those college towns have a lot in common. It's not that hard to draw a pretty fair map where if there was a big Republican wave election, they'd sweep everything outside the Chicago metro unless there was an extremely popular incumbent who ran ahead. And if there's a blue leaning cycle, Republicans could end up with, at worst, as many districts as they have now permanently under our gerrymander, right? The biggest difference here is competition. Nevada probably has us beat for the most, I'm going to say, in an evil way, kind of impressive gerrymander by a Democratic legislature. So for those unfamiliar with Nevada's geography, most of the state lives in Clark County, which is where Las Vegas is, way in the southern end. Reno has a decent population. Carson City, which is right next to Reno, that's the blue spots you see on the west end there, have decent populations, but it's largely the Vegas metropolitan area. Most of what you see there is uninhabited desert. All right, over 80% of Nevada is federal land where nobody lives, right? You know, the Bundys illegally graze cattle. But you can see that in 2022, most voters in Nevada voted for a Republican U.S. House candidate. Yet 3 of the 4 districts went Democratic because they managed to divide the Las Vegas metro so perfectly balancedly and pack so many Republicans into one district that even though Mark Amodei was reelected by 22% because they just sunk as many Republicans as they could into his district, Democrats won the other 3 districts by between 4 and 5.6%. That's amazing precision. And it speaks to how predictable voters are by demographics and geography, especially because Nevada has the most population turnover of any state in the country, right? So they were this precise, even though, right, the pandemic shut down the strip and a ton of working class Nevadans moved to find work elsewhere. Their population turns over drastically every cycle, yet they were this precise. It's impressive and super duper unethical. But, you know, be good or be good at it, right? Though I will say, because those margins were so small, remember, 2022 was not a red wave. It was a red trickle, right? Voting nationally skewed a little Republican. So this is potentially what you might call a dummy mander, which is when you try to gerrymander a state and then you spread your voters too thin, where say instead of, it was like, the national vote was like Republican plus 2. Say it was instead Republican plus 7, 8. it's possible they all would have lost and all 4 districts would have gone Republican, right? So that's sort of the risk of it backfiring in theory. So how do we stop people from cheating? States have a lot of ideas. So here you have an overview of which states let politicians do it, draw their own lines, which states don't have congressional lines to draw in the first place, which ones have independent commissions, and which ones have formal commission processes that are still effectively controlled by politicians. Right. As you can see, independent commissions are mostly a phenomenon of the Western US, with the exceptions of Michigan and New York. Though in New York, they're talking about overruling theirs. So here you see in practice who drew the districts in each state. So deep red is Republican politicians drew the districts with no guardrails at all. Deep blue is Democrats did it with no guardrails at all. You notice a bit of an imbalance. The bright yellows are independent commissions. For anyone who's concerned about trying to fight back against this disadvantage, the fact that California has an independent commission drawing 52 districts looms very large, because it's one of the bluest states in the country, and they've chosen to be fair, right? And then the one state in the country with a bipartisan compromise map is nice, gentle Minnesota. The sweet people they are. Well, it's actually because Republicans controlled the state Senate and Democrats controlled the state House, and eventually they had to move on with their lives, so they came up with something. And the map they had before was pretty fair. They hardly had to change it. But sweet, sweet Minnesota, the only example of people getting along. The gray states are the ones where a court struck down the map and redid it themselves. Utah might be added to that list. You saw on September 15th, there was a decision that I'll talk about a little bit later. That's breakdowns by seat. So 41% of all congressional districts were drawn by Republican politicians with no guardrails. If you include the ones who have some constraints on their power, it gets to 45. Only 11 or 16, depending on how you define it, % of districts were drawn by Democrats in that way. So yeah, bit tilted. So what is a fair map? What does that look like in practice? Fair map is legal. That's important. I gotta say that, I'm a lawyer. Proportional, right? So the percentage of the statewide vote that a party gets should look something like the percentage of seats they get. Competitive, right? You want swing districts where your representative is afraid of voters from either party. Minimizing splits of counties and municipalities so it feels geographically coherent and everybody knows which levels of government their district representative is working with, right? Granted, if any of you live in Aurora, that's in 4 different counties, so we already messed that up a lot locally with splitting. Compact, so geographically compact area so that it's serviceable for constituent services purposes, and it basically just doesn't look crazy. And keeping communities of interest together so that the people within a district feel they have something in common with each other. So that when you ask the representative of that district, where do you represent? They can explain it in a sentence, right? You could say, I represent the Salt Lake City metropolitan area, instead of saying, I represent a quarter of Utah that was picked to make sure I'd be a Republican, right? But balancing these factors is very complicated in practice. So I was just talking about Utah. Here's an example, bad proportionality. It's a very red state, don't get me wrong. Utah leans very, very Republican. So it might not shock you to hear that all 4 of their representatives are Republicans. But what's with that spiral in the middle of the state? You see by Salt Lake City there, where all of the districts converge there? That looks suspicious. It's super intentional. They carved up Salt Lake City and Park City, which are the 2 big blue cities in this otherwise very red state. They cracked them. You could draw a blue district there, and they chose not to. More than a quarter of the state's voters are Democrats. It's perfectly proportional to say, yes, I know Utah's very Republican, but Democrats do live there. They've like 1 million of them. And they can have their own very compact district where everyone lives near each other in the same metropolitan area. In 2018, Utah voters passed a ballot initiative creating an independent redistricting commission. And then Utah state legislature passed a law allowing them to ignore it. The Utah Supreme Court recently ordered them to pay attention to it because that's what the law the voters passed said. There's a very, very complicated decision that totally needed to take that long, right? Meanwhile, we've had multiple congressional elections on a map that was illegal the whole time, right? The gears of justice move too slowly sometimes. So a proportional map could look like this. And hopefully we're going to get something out of this decision that looks something like that. And I say hopefully not because I tend to lean toward Democrats myself, but because this is fairer for Utah's voters. And I have a soft spot for the place. I have friends there. I know some very sad people in Salt Lake City who are very liberal. So competitiveness. New York's congressional map actually has a ton of swing districts in it by kind of weird historical accident. So if you've heard of the Hochulmander, the New York governor, Kathy Hochul, right, had the famous gerrymander map that the state Supreme Court struck down. Now, I should mention, the state Supreme Court in Utah is strongly Republican, but they held Republicans in their state to the laws passed by their voters. Good for them. Similarly, in New York, the Democratic-controlled state Supreme Court told the state's Democrats, you know, we have a state constitution provision against this. And so they ended up, after much back and forth, enacting this map where these colorings that you see, that's the partisan result of the US House elections here in 2022. You see a lot of really light shades because there were a lot of really close elections. The resulting map features 6 districts that were decided by less than 4% in the 2022 midterms. 7 of them were decided by less than 10%, and 8 in 2024 had a presidential margin of less than 10%. There are entire huge regions of the country that have less swing districts than just New York does. You know, the US House is very close, right? Republicans won the House in New York, in a way, by winning competitive districts there. And so in 2026, there are talks in New York about overriding that legal provision and gerrymandering to advantage Democrats. It's possible that will happen. But even on this competitive map, if it's a strong Democratic cycle, you can expect Democrats to win most or all of those very close, tight-knit districts. They did already flip, I believe it was the 3rd district back because I don't know if you've heard of George Santos, but yeah, that was him. People voted for a fictional version of him, and then things got weird. So, but when you're trying to draw competitive districts, redistricting happens at a snapshot, a specific moment in time. And so Arizona after the 2010 census, they have an independent redistricting commission. But the data that they were going by in being tasked to draw competitive swing districts, right? It's in the law that they have to try, among other things, they have to try to draw competitive districts. The data they had was from 2008, when John McCain was the presidential nominee. He was kind of popular in Arizona, right? And in 2010, it was a big Republican wave cycle. Both of those cycles masked an underlying partisan trend in Arizona that the state was actually getting blue. So then they enacted a map that they thought was very fair and had a lot of swing districts. And then in 2012, which was a slightly blue-leaning cycle, but it wasn't a huge wave, right? Obama was reelected, but it wasn't like 2008. Democrats got 9% less votes, but won a majority of the state's districts because of a good faith effort to try to draw swing districts that then the partisanship of the state moved underneath their feet. So different demographics trend differently, moving districts with districts with lots of those types of people will move in that direction, right? So if you have a swing district where the Democratic base is heavily Latino and then their margins with Latinos disimprove, that district could become redder, right? If you have a swing district with a lot of very educated people, they're getting more Democratic over time, that district steadily gets bluer. Illinois had a kind of similar thing happen. That same redistricting cycle in the 2010s, if people have been following since back then, those two downstate districts you see, the old versions of the 12th and the 13th that are lighter red, those were drawn to re-elect downstate Democratic members of Congress. But in 2014, the bottom fell out on rural support for Democrats, and they both lost. Then in 2018, Democrats flipped to what were supposed to be Republican vote sync districts, the 14th and the 6th, getting us Lauren Underwood and Sean Casten, right? And if you told Mike Madigan, who was heavily involved in drawing this map back then, that the two downstate Democrats were going to lose and we were going to then 2 cycles later flip the 6th and the 14th, he would have laughed in your face, right? People did not see the education polarization we've experienced and the sort of blue collar, white collar distinction becoming so prevalent. They didn't see that coming. It used to be that part of why the suburbs were so Republican was that there were so many college grads there, right? The older Republicans in my neighborhood all think I'm a Republican because I went to college and I'm a white guy, right? Because they haven't really kept up with the fact that the local nonprofit attorney is probably not super conservative. So I'm pretty proud of this map. In 2012, Obama won the national popular vote by roughly 4%, and he won Illinois by roughly 17%. In 2020, Biden had almost exactly the same margin nationally and in Illinois, but they're very different maps. They got their votes from different places. So this is a precinct by precinct breakdown of trends, right? So the redder parts voted more for Trump than they did for Romney, right? So the redder parts trended more Republican than where they used to be from 2012 to 2008 to 2020. And then the blue parts moved in a more democratic direction in those 8 years. This pattern tracks college degree rates eerily closely, right? You see a bunch of college towns and the capital and the sort of more affluent suburbs of Chicago and in Metro East bluer, and the rest of the state redder, like the more blue collar areas. And you'll notice that when I say blue collar, people often make that distinction of white working class. You could throw out the white part. You see the predominantly working class parts of Metro East and Chicago and Rockford and communities with a lot of people of color who are more working class also trended more Republican than they were. It's just that they went from gigantic Democratic margins to slightly less huge, right? The baseline was different, but the trend is similar. And so when you are thinking about how a district is going to vote moving forward in the decade, you have to think about these long-term trends, and they're not always predictable. Another thing to look at in trying to draw a fair map is minimizing splits. Here you see Ohio's congressional map. Ohio has a state constitution provision that was enacted by voters. You'll notice a pattern of voter ballot initiatives restraining politicians instead of politicians restraining themselves in a lot of states. And one of the rules in it is that there are very strict limits on how much and when you can carve up and split counties and cities of certain populations. And so effectively, it's a limit on cracking, right? You can still pack a bunch of, it's a Republican-controlled state, Republican-controlled process, right? Still partisan. you can still pack Democrats into as few districts as you can, but you can't slice it up, right? You can't do what Republicans did to Salt Lake City. You can't do what Republicans did to Nashville, Tennessee, right? And so as a result, we end up with this map where these other lines that you see within the districts, those are county borders. You have these very clean lines that track county borders really well because they legally had to do that. Republicans are about to redraw this because the law says in Ohio if the Republicans and Democrats involved in the process can't agree to the same map, then they have to redraw it after 3 cycles. So they have to redraw it soon. And Republicans are probably going to try as hard as they can to make it even more Republican. Because, I should mention, if they were allowed to do whatever they wanted, there would probably be only 2 Democrats in the state, in Cleveland and in Columbus. Because of these guardrails, right? It's still Republicans drawing it, but there are things they're not allowed to do geographically. There are 5 Democrats representing Ohio. Now, 3 of them are in very competitive districts and can lose, but they had a shot and they won. Here's a state that has 0 county splits. Iowa has an independent commission that is not allowed to look at voting data at all. They're not allowed to consider how anywhere has ever voted. They're not allowed to know how their districts voted. And Iowa, frankly, is so homogeneously white that the Voting Rights Act doesn't really come up, right? And so they just played a logic puzzle game of how can we draw 4 districts with no county splits with equal population, and they did it. And coincidentally, 3 of those districts are competitive, which was an accident as far as I know. Yeah, that's pretty competitive. Some of the closest congressional elections in the country the last few cycles have been in Iowa. Republicans have won all of them, but I think one of them was decided by less than 15 votes. Like, that could have just as easily gone the other way, right? That's not the map maker's fault. That's, the coin flip landed one way. And so Iowa, their independent process, stumbled upon a map that in a huge blue wave cycle, in theory, could end up with 3 Democrats representing a red state, which seems like a little bit of a screwy outcome to some, right? Do you emphasize competitiveness or proportionality? Because don't get me wrong, the 4th district is packing Republicans, right? That's a pretty red state. And to have 3 districts that only voted for Trump by a little bit, and one where he got the margins that you would usually expect from like a dictator in the other district, right? That's a big win for competitiveness and compactness and splitting, because there's no county splits. But you could argue it's not very proportional to give Democrats a realistic shot at winning 3/4 of the districts without necessarily winning a majority of the vote, right? So it's an independent process that wasn't intentional, but it's a real trade-off that happened. If you were to maximize compactness in Illinois, you would get something that looked like this. Those are really like aesthetically pleasing lines. If you showed that to someone with no context, they'd be like, that is a fair map, right? Because that's kind of what your brain does. It's like, oh, you just made the most compact shapes you could with equal population. But it's a Voting Rights Act violation, right? They destroyed majority Black and Latino districts to do this. None of these districts are competitive. And it's split communities of interest in ways that are totally incoherent. Like, these lines go through the middle of subdivisions where like people who live across the street from each other and their kids probably play together after school are in different districts, right? So telling a computer to maximize geographic compactness can't fully replace human judgment. Communities of interest, like I was talking about, is really heavily emphasized in California. California also has an independent redistricting commission. They are asked among other things, to respect communities of interest. They travel around the state asking local residents, they have public town halls asking them, what is your community of interest? Right? I remember there was an example of some people in the exurbs of Los Angeles County said that they lived in a community with a lot of horse ranches, and that a lot of the families, even if their kids went to different schools and they were in different municipalities and all that, they all knew each other from horseback riding, right? And they all went to the same stores for feed and everything, and they were all part of the same sort of niche economy. And that's the kind of thing that you wouldn't know unless you went and asked them, right? That's a sort of very specific example of a community of interest, right? Splitting them up between multiple districts would feel weird to the people who live there. If you know, so I lived in California for 3 years. I went to law school in Berkeley. If you know the geography of the state, I gotta say, it's very hard to draw 52 districts, comply with the VRA, and make the map look coherent at the end. But they did a pretty darn good job of keeping together communities that have sort of natural borders. You can make out specific mountain ranges and bodies of water that divide towns and neighborhoods from each other to where they don't really know each other well on either side. You can see sort of communities that have a lot in common sticking together in the same district. Now, I will say though, Republicans complain about proportionality in California, and they often accuse the Independent Commission of Democratic gerrymandering because a larger percentage of the districts lean Democratic than the vote in California leans Democratic, which is saying a lot because California is a very blue state. But it's actually not intentionally rigged, as far as I know. California is weird. So California, Arizona, Texas, and New York are 4 examples of states that come to mind where, because there are so many people who live there but aren't eligible to vote, as they're either immigrants who are not full citizens yet or are children, and they tend to live in Democratic parts of the state, it takes less votes to win their typical blue district, if that makes sense. Because you have the same population, but less people who can vote. And those districts that are like that tend to be bluer on average. You also have that most of the Republicans in California live in Democratic-leaning precincts. It's just a matter of the geography of the state of California. So in most states, if you ignored partisanship and just tried to draw based on boring geographical things, you would end up probably advantaging Republicans. But California is a rare state where when you do that, you would probably end up advantaging Democrats because of those quirks. And that is way too complicated to explain for most people in the state who would just complain. So to get a more proportional map, you would have to intentionally help Republicans. Back to the earmuffs district. So Illinois' 4th congressional district used to look like that. Shaped like earmuffs. It's not compact. It's super ugly to look at, but it was a voting rights district. It combined Latino communities. So in the northwest side of the city and in the southwest side of the city of Chicago, you have there connected 2 predominantly Latino neighborhoods. And the reason it juts out so far to connect them is because between there is the west side of Chicago, which is predominantly Black. And instead of drawing compact districts that were roughly, half, or, where they had roughly equal Black and Latino populations, and you turned every Democratic primary into a racial conflict between neighborhoods that don't talk to each other a whole lot because the city's so segregated. It's sad, but it is true. It's a fact of life. Instead of carving up 2 districts with communities that had very little in common, they took a weird geographic shape and had districts that were more sort of demographically and community of interest coherent, right? And the Voting Rights Act asks you to do that because they want there to be a district where Black voters get to make a choice, and they want there to be a district where Latino voters get to make a choice. And I emphasize empowering voters not necessarily picking the race of the representative that they choose. Because I'll give you an example. In Tennessee, Steve Cohen represents a predominantly Black district and is a white guy, and he's pretty popular there. His constituents like him. People can choose whoever they want, but they should have the right to choose. Chicago's Voting Rights Act districts have changed in shape today. As you see here, the sort of brown-red is the predominantly Latino districts, the third and the fourth. The suburban Latino population has grown over the years, allowing them to draw a second Latino Opportunity District. And you still see the three Black Opportunity Districts that have held over from the previous map, albeit in a different shape. The state has lost Black population and it lost a district. It is getting harder, frankly, to maintain the same percentages, like the same portion of Black population in those districts for people trying to draw. But obviously the principle of the matter and complying with federal law are very important. And so we end up with funky shapes, but it's for an honest to God good reason. And it's worth noting, these are not partisan gerrymanders. If anything, they're packing a ton of Democratic voters into these districts, right? The surrounding area, it's very, 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 very blue. They're carving up one blue area versus another, right? This is not part of gerrymandering the state. Granted, the predominantly white districts also have ridiculous shapes, and that's kind of a bad sign, right? So how to fix a gerrymander? Pennsylvania's gerrymander that was in place from 2012 to 2016 looked like this monstrosity. Is a 50-50 swing state, but 13 of 18 districts were safely Republican. Pennsylvania's 7th district looked like Goofy kicking Donald Duck in the ass, right? This is absurd. So Pennsylvania State Supreme Court, after it flipped Democratic, struck that map down, but they didn't say, haha, now we're going to gerrymander against you, Republicans. They forced a fair map. Court took a bunch of submissions, and after balancing many factors, they chose the map you see there, which tries to minimize county municipality splits and draw competitive districts and a fair balance. Democrats got 55% of the vote in 2018 and 50% of the seats. They would have gotten 55% of the seats, except popular moderate Republican Brian Fitzpatrick of Bucks County ran ahead of the Republican ticket and won his district, which, good for him. That's democracy. You get to pick who you want, right? No party is entitled to seats. He's a competitive district. It was a tough cycle for his party, but he took votes that his constituents liked and became popular and won. That used to be more common. But now we're getting to the unilateral disarmament, right? People talk about a lot. You can try to do the fair principle thing in your state, and I want to be clear, at the state and local level, there was no excuse for partisan gerrymandering. But at Congress, you are competing within the context of what's going on in other states. So, as you can see here, this is one measure of extremeness of gerrymanders. The net gap in efficiency gap, which just measures gaps in proportionality comparing the statewide vote to the seat share, in 2012 was the most Republican skewing map after the last census in 2010, right? The one before this most recent one, that the authors of this study had seen going back to the 1970s. Because Republicans took control of a lot of state legislatures in 2010 in that red wave, and now they had computers. That last decade's worst offenders, right? The authors proposed a threshold past which you should presume it was an intentional partisan gerrymander and strike it down. Every single one of the maps that violated their standard was in the Republican direction, right? The worst Democratic offenders didn't come up against their line. Really drastic. But this decade's complicated that picture a little bit. I want to be fair here. The Republican efficiency gap metric I showed you peaked in 2012. In fact, the 2024 presidential vote by district implies Democrats, by some measures, had a slight advantage compared to their national vote share. But since then, Republicans in Texas redrew their maps to flip several districts, moving the median district rightward. In the country, Missouri, Ohio, Florida, they might do the same thing. Further, moving the median, that 218th seat to get a majority, farther and farther Republican compared to the national vote. In response, California voters are considering a special election a ballot initiative to pass a already published, already shown to them Democratic gerrymander map that would be in place until the next redistricting cycle when the independent commission would get to do its job again. This is seen as a way to try to fight back. So I have to ask again, what is fair? Now, enough of me talking. I want to hear from you all.
Thank you, Eric. So for everyone that has questions, if you can put the questions into the chat and put question in capital letters before and post your question into the chat, we will call on you once you post your question in the chat. So it looks like our first question is from Marcy.
Yes, my question is, Texas already is gerrymandered. I mean, before this, they were totally gerrymandered. What are the odds that they stretched it so much this time around because they already had gerrymandered as much as they thought they could? What are the odds that they would have stretched it so thin that they now have competitive districts where they didn't before?
So the odds of a dummy mander is what you're saying, right?
Yes.
So that almost happened in 2018. So Texas is a low turnout state, so it can be hard to predict who's actually going to show up. In 2018, led by Beto O'Rourke's very spirited challenge to Senator Ted Cruz, in which he lost by less than 3%, his coattails sort of turning out a lot more liberal-leaning voters who usually skip midterms in the state, almost flipped several U.S. House districts that have been drawn to elect Republicans. They've gotten a lot redder. So Texas gained, I think it was 2 districts in the census. So one of the things the census does, in addition to telling you where you need to redraw lines because you won or gained or lost population, it also reapportions how many districts each state gets. Texas's population is booming. They gain districts. And they had more, the more granular you draw a map, the more chicanery you can do, right? Because the more lines you're drawing. And there's also the serious complication that, so you saw the Rio Grande Valley, that used to be a very blue area. It ain't anymore, right? Now the only way that I could see it backfiring in some sense would be the ways that they carved up the Rio Grande Valley could end up backfiring if the Latino vote looks more like what it did a couple cycles ago than what it seems to be trending toward, right? And I should note, Latinos are not a monolith, right? Various ethnic backgrounds and geographies. Latinos in Texas have tended to vote more Republican than Latinos nationally for like ever. A lot of them are, a lot of their families have been in Texas longer than America's been a country, right? And a lot of them don't see themselves as an other, right? And within the Rio Grande Valley, you have a ton of immigrants, but you have like this really strong ranchero culture that's like very libertarian in a lot of ways. And so they're not necessarily the cleanest fit for the national like stereotypes you might have of their community, right? And the Texas Republican Party, we have to give them credit, has done really effective outreach with this community for a long time. Like the Bushes were always very popular within the Latino parts of Texas, right? Rick Perry did well there. And so Governor Abbott has done well there. But if those trends were to reverse, you could see them not picking up districts they wanted to in the Rio Grande Valley. But in order for them to actually lose districts down there, De La Cruz's district, the 15th, would have to swing back the other way. That's really the only theoretical exposure I see for them. Outside of that, like all of their sort of carving up big cities that they did, the districts they drew, we're talking like Trump plus 15 to 25 districts. You would need a really, really big shift in how an entire cohort of their population votes. So not in the foreseeable future, with the exception that I laid out at the beginning there, which would require a reversal, but not a drastic one.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you, Marcy, for that question. For those of you that weren't able to join us last month, we actually had Texas State House Minority Leader Representative Wu on. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about Texas and what's going on there, definitely we will put the link to the recording into the chat so that you can hear a little bit more about Texas. It looks like there was a question from Kimberly, but I believe Kimberly had to leave. I don't see her on. Her question was, what can we do to undo gerrymandering? What is our call to action? How can we change this nationally?
Yeah, so the HR or HB, I forget which one, the Democratic House proposal that dates back to, I want to say 2019, I think was the first time they introduced that. Does a lot on independent redistricting and effectively banning partisan gerrymandering for Congress. I don't think it touched state legislatures because they had some questions as to federal jurisdiction on that, right? But at least for Congress can do something about it. It would not necessarily require a constitutional amendment. Granted, the Supreme Court kind of does what it wants sometimes, So, in theory, maybe you need a constitutional amendment, but there are legislative proposals out there. I mean, the most common approach is just trying to push as many states as possible to go with independent commissions. Usually the distinction between whether it's politicians drawing the lines or common citizens doing it has tended to be the most important distinction. Though I will note that in Ohio, of course, they've had some restraints and a partial step towards something looking a little fairer than what they would do otherwise, even though one party was still drawing its own districts because they just limited the tools in the toolbox. Right. So that's sort of, that's the main thing. I think it's House Bill 1.
Fantastic. And for those of you that may have been involved with OFA back in the day, it has actually transformed into an organization called All on the Line. It's led by Eric Holder now, and they're specifically advocating for fair maps nationally. So we'll put the link to that in the chat as well. They have a lot of interesting meetings, and they have organizations in each state that are specifically pushing for this at the national level. So we'll get some information out to you all about that and how you can advocate for that. Looks like the next question was from Kent. Kent, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, and you should be able to speak now.
Great. Yes, I thank you for the talk. It was awesome presentation and awesome data. I think you might have just answered. I was asking if a national law has ever been drafted and proposed, and I think you just answered that in 2019. That was on the docket. So if that is a correct understanding that is answered, what was the result of that vote, and what do you think the next steps are? Do we need different proposals, or do we just need the right Congress to repropose it?
So the biggest barrier to doing that is, one, every single Republican is against it in Congress. Two, some Democrats won't say it out loud, but are probably against it because of their own districts. And three, because it's not budget reconciliation, where you're not just moving money around. In the Senate, it's subject to the filibuster rule. And so unless Democrats were to take control of the majority of the US Senate and change their own rules to allow a vote to move forward without a 60 vote cloture vote, so the filibuster traditionally was in the Senate. There's no rule limiting how long one senator can talk. And so they can shut down business by just refusing to shut up. And it takes 60 votes to tell them to shut up. It's a cloture vote. In modern practice, they don't actually make them stand up and talk the whole time because, they have wealthy donors to call and important steak dinners and stuff to go to. So they just have them turn in a little slip that says I filibuster, and then they're like, oh, okay. If we don't have 60 votes, it's dead. And so they've basically required a supermajority requirement that's not in the Constitution in any way, by quirk of their own procedural rules. The House used to have a filibuster way back in the day, like 100 years ago, and they got rid of it because it was stupid. And the Senate held on to it because the Senate doesn't change like ever. And senators like to be able to say, oh, I'd really vote for that thing if it weren't for those pesky other people who won't vote for cloture, and to be able to hide behind that, right? And so, whereas if I were in that role, I'd like to think I would want to just do my job, but I'll never be in that role, right? And so, unless they change the filibuster, you would need a 60 vote supermajority in the Senate to pass something like this because it's not budget reconciliation or the confirmation of a presidential nomination, which are basically the only two things that Republicans ever want passing, right? Those are already exempt, but nothing else is. And so, that's really the barrier. They never had the votes. Now, Democrats had the presidency, a thin majority in the Senate, and a majority in the House, all at the same time for Biden's first 2 years in office. And they didn't pass this because they didn't have support for ending the filibuster.
Right. Looks like there is a question from Sarah G. Sarah, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Awesome, thanks. I have a question that I have not been able to find an answer to. It's about Texas, so I hope that's not too down in the weeds, but you might find it interesting. I'm in District 21, and our part of our town got gerrymandered into 35. 35 is Republican. The person who's going to run against him is a Democrat, and I feel like they pushed us over. I think this is a more Democratic area, and I can't make it fit into anything I've learned about why they would move people and demographic. Like, this one doesn't fit. It's strange, and so we could be one of those areas that we could turn this next one over because that's a growing county as well. We could turn that one blue, and then 21 could turn blue because the congressman he's going to run for another position in Texas. So hopefully we could get a Democrat. So it's really baffling. And on a note
You're talking about Chip Roy?
I didn't want to say it. Yes. So on the border in Texas, it's also, they've got some of the poorest counties in the state. And I think they could be flipped also because of economics and the torture that's happening in their communities.
So you're talking about, the 21st and 35th, so the Austin metropolitan area.
Yeah, south of it, Hayes County, and he goes from Hayes County down to San Antonio. He's in Kerrville.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's weird.
That's the current district. It's it's like a straight diagonal that like highways between the two metros. Yeah, I'm familiar with the district. So I don't have the breakdown in front of me yet, but you can see on this map I pulled up, Austin just east of what's now 37 is what you're talking about, like southeast of there. And if it's colored that red, that means Trump won it by more than 20.
But so I'm in Buda, and they're pulling half of Buda, which is a lot of teachers and young families, over east into 35, which I'm like, What? So you're saying they
Yeah,
would mostly be Trump voters?
no, I'm saying that it's cracking.
Yeah.
So, right, so you're being paired with way Republican communities to your east. That district keeps the reason you don't see a number in there is because I'm close up. Let me see, I'll show you. Okay, yeah, the new, so you're in 27, then it would be, or 21. Yeah, so this is just like southeast of Austin. Then that's a district that looks like it voted for Trump by more than 15 in like the whole district put together, not just your area, voted for Trump by more than 15 in 2020 and more than 20 in 2024. So what they did was, if we're talking about 27, then they drew it all the way out to the border, like you were talking about. Or I shouldn't say the border, the Gulf. That's water, right? The border of the state, right? They drew it all the way out to the coast. You're picking up a ton of rural, very, very Republican communities that they lumped in together with what sounds like a bluer community that you're in. That's called cracking, is when you carve up a community that votes one way and pair them with a bunch of far-flung places that vote differently, sort of the way Utah carved up Salt Lake City into 4 pieces. And Tennessee did that to Nashville too. That, unfortunately, the math is really difficult. Granted, you should always, never say never. You should always fight. Like I said, Illinois drew downstate districts thinking they'd elect Democrats, and suburban, exurban districts thinking they'd draw Republicans or vote for Republicans, and they were wrong about both of those after a couple cycles. It might not happen right away, but it can happen, right? It can always change. So I don't want to discourage you in any way. I just want to describe the nature of what was done to your community and the intentions that they had in doing so.
Right. Looks like the next question is from Rachel Cook. Rachel, I am going to unmute you. You should be able to unmute yourself, Rachel.
Great. So I've been studying electoral reform for a little while now, and the redistricting certainly comes up as like one of the top 3 things. It's kind of the triumvirate of open primaries, ranked choice voting, or some kind of different voting, and redistricting. Just from everything that I've read, and your presentation was fabulous, but it just confirms to me that, man, that's like the most complex of the 3. But I just would like your thoughts on whether or not starting with something even as simple as, by simple, I still mean it's the Sisyphean push up the mountain, trying to break the locks of the 2 parties on the voters, just focusing on, say, open primaries at both state and local offices. Would it be a simpler way to begin reform that would net us results by producing more moderate elected officials? I just would like your thoughts on that.
I want to ask a clarifying question.
Yes.
When you say open primaries, so that can mean a few. I hear that term used to refer to a couple completely different things, right?
No, by open primaries, I mean, because I see Illinois referred to as an open primary, and it is not open. It is semi-closed, but I mean all parties, and not only are our primaries virtually locked into 2 parties, you can't have independent people running in primaries. They only can run in general elections. And so I say, open it up. Anybody that wants to run runs in a primary on 1 ballot. That's open primaries to me.
Sure. So then, in terms of choosing who goes on to the general election, so I'll go over how a couple different states do this, right? So in Washington and California, they have the top two system, where doesn't matter what party you're in, the top two vote getters move on to the general election. A concern some people have with that is you get partisan lockouts. Sometimes you get a situation where, let's say it's a pretty blue-leaning area, but 20 Democrats run and 2 Republicans run. Each Republican gets half of the Republican vote, and the Democrats split it 20 ways. And then you get 2 Republicans in the general election for a blue district. And then you have all this pressure of the party is trying to bully people out of the primary because they don't want to split the vote. Happens all the time in California and Washington, right? And then alternatively, you could have something like in Alaska, now they have a top 4 primary, and it's also ranked choice. So they do ranked choice, and the last 4 candidates left, regardless of party, go on to the general. The idea being they want to seriously lower the odds of a lockout and diminish strategic voting. So then there's this trade-off between how many people go forward, right? Because you want to restrict general election ballot access to some extent because you just don't want to overwhelm people with choices. If you don't have ranked choice voting, you want to avoid a spoiler effect of 3rd and 4th candidates, maybe. And if you do have ranked choice voting, you want to allow people to conceivably do enough research to actually have an opinion on how to rank all these people, right? And you don't want the airwaves and their mailboxes flooded by people who can't win. But in the other direction, you want to include people to avoid lockouts and to avoid a situation where you still have the same problem of if they're not enough people's first choice in a partisan primary, because primary turnout is low, right? Whether it's open or closed or whatever, like people don't show up to primaries unless they're very engaged, generally. And and very engaged voters tend to be more partisan and they tend to be more ideological, right? And that's a trend that I wish would change, but that's where we're at, right? And so that's sort of the trade-off that you have. So I guess in terms of the examples that exist in the world, those would be sort of the different models to look at in terms of how many candidates move on and by what system.
Right. I believe Linda has a question, but for anyone else that has a question, please put it into the chat with a question in caps and we will call on you. But let's go to Linda now.
Thanks, Patrick. So, Eric, given what I'm going to call it the gerrymandering race war that's going on right now, starting with Texas and then what California might do. I know you don't have a crystal ball, but how do you think this could end? And who will win?
So if everybody took the brakes off, so I would encourage people to read. So I believe, I forget if at least 2 of these publications, of these 3 publications recently put out something about, it was here. Sabato's Crystal Ball from the University of Virginia Center for Politics, Split Picket, which my friend Laksha Jain is one of the co-founders of that outlet, and they work with The Conversation now. And the third group was I think it was Decision Desk HQ. At least I think 2 of those 3 publications, but I'm blurring the newsletters in my head. Recently came out with an analysis saying, what if we threw out all the rules, right, and just let everybody go to town? Who would win this knife fight? Who's in the position to do the most damage to the other? If you leave the Voting Rights Act in place, Republicans get a huge advantage over Democrats. If you get rid of it, that gets even worse. Because interestingly, the Voting Rights Act, you could say it constrains blue states because there's a degree of packing that it pretty much forces, right? Like if you have demographics that, these minority racial groups tend to be very Democratic leaning. And so if you have to include a lot of that group in a district, you're making it a super duper blue district and you're kind of wasting a ton of Democratic votes if you're trying to spread them out to win as many districts. You can't just bacon mander the whole state, right? and just have a bunch of districts that all vote like the statewide Illinois vote of Democrat plus 15 or so because of that. But in red states, it would mean we would lose every blue district in a red state, all of them, right? The ones that are still there, a whole lot of them are because of the Voting Rights Act, right? The ones in Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana, right? Those would be gone, for example. So yeah, the big picture is the rules that we do have tend to help, and it could be worse. And we have a playing field where Texas already did its damage, right? Ohio can probably only do a little more. Missouri is probably going to blow up the Kansas City district. That's one. Florida is always trying to find new ways to gain more districts, right? Let's say they could do another 2 or something. Then you're in an environment where, let's say in theory, the 218th district votes 2.5 points, let's say, more Republican than the country as a whole. House still flips in 2026. But let's say 2028 is a really close election. You could have a situation where most people vote for Democrats, but Republicans control the House again, right? It'll still matter on the margins. With the guardrails we have in place and the partisan composition that we have, we're talking about differences that sound trivial to someone who isn't keyed into just how polarized everything is and just how much a couple points on the margins matters and how little incumbency matters now. It used to be if you already represented a district and you were running for re-election, it was like a given you would run way ahead of your party's presidential nominee, as long as your constituents didn't hate you, right? That's not true anymore. Incumbency is worth like 3 points now, typically. So they're just as swept up in waves as everybody else, with a few exceptions. So that's what I would say is it's a little bad nationally. It could be a little worse. Will survive from a Democrat versus Republican standpoint, but the tie would go to the Republicans, right? Like the tie goes to runner in baseball. Like they would win on the margins, and that's a problem. And more importantly, in my view, because look, anything that disadvantages Democrats in the long run, was that that forces Democrats to move in a direction that emulates the preferences of the types of voters who've been voting Republican up till then, right? Eventually, it makes them soften their stances on certain things to try to appeal to voters in certain places. That's ultimately what it does, right? Where that's, right, it's not a permanent, it's not like the Democrats would be permanently frozen out of the majority. They would have to change. But what's lost there is majoritarianism and democracy. Voters, a majority of voters, believe in these stances and want positive change on that front and will be denied it because a party cannot gain control without appealing to a more conservative minority on those issues. And that's where I think in a democracy sense it gets offensive, is not so much the fight between Democrats and Republicans, but the forcing outcomes that most of the country doesn't want on policy.
All right. Thank you, Eric. This has been a very, very informative panel. You know, Eric is one of our best map makers in the state. Whenever we have questions just on maps or other things, Eric is one of the people to call. I do want to open it up for any of the board members that may have any final remarks, whether it's Jeanette or Linda. And Marcy, I know you've got a couple of events that you want to announce, but maybe we'll start with Linda or Jeanette. Do you have anything? If not, Linda.
No,
I do not have anything at this time. Thank you.
Okay. Let's go to Marcy. I know you have a couple of events that you want to announce, or any other closing statements.
Just a reminder about the phone banks. every Saturday and Sunday. On Saturdays, we're phone banking to Virginia to let Virginia voters know to vote for Abigail Spanberger, and also some down ballot candidates that are also statewide. And we do that from 5 to 6:30 Central Time on Zoom. And I put the links in the chat a couple times, but I'll put them in again. And actually, it is really a tight race. And Abigail Spanberger, of course, is running for governor, and they are already in early voting. On Sundays, we're 4 to 5:30. I did say 5 to 6:30, right, for Saturdays, because that's changed. Anyway, 4 to 5:30 on Saturdays, we're phone banking into the 3 Republican districts in Illinois, the Illinois 12, Mike Boss district, Illinois 15, Mary Miller's district, and Illinois 16, Darren LaHood's district, to let their voters know that they voted to cut Medicaid and what that means to them and what that means to their communities. And I will put the links in the chat one more time there. And that's for the next 3 weeks. So you guys all rock. And Eric, you rock really big time.
Thank you, Marcy. And also, Eric, are there any final remarks that you have or anything that you want to give out to anyone?
Yeah, so you can see on the slide here, you can email me at my last name dot my first name at Gmail. I admittedly, my wife is due to have our second kid within the next couple of weeks, so don't be discouraged if I don't get back to you for a minute. It'll just probably mean that I'll have super happy news when I do. So yeah, just thank you guys so much. This was fun. Your questions were honestly very thoughtful. And it's obvious that the people who asked them are really serious about this topic, and like everything was in really good faith and substantive. And I really appreciate having those kinds of conversations. So thank you.
Thank you, Eric. We appreciate it. For everyone, we'll have our next panel coming up next month, so be on the lookout for that. Also, we've got the No Kings 2, which is coming up in October, so be on the lookout for that. There are events that are happening all across the country for No Kings 2, so we'll send out a couple of emails. It's on October the 18th. There are events that are likely happening locally in your town, so you can sign up for that to protect democracy. Also, many of you know about what's happening here in Illinois with the threat of the National Guard coming in, as well as threats to immigrant communities and the raids that are happening. We're going to have some details on how we're going to be sending a strong message that we support our immigrant friends and neighbors here within Illinois, so be on the lookout for that, of how we'll go out to local businesses and other things, just showing our support for immigrant communities that are hurting right now. So thank you all for joining. We look forward to seeing you at one of our upcoming events. Have a good evening, everyone.